And welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wyenberg. This time we will continue our reading of Early Days by Miss Reed. When we moved, I had hoped fondly that this torture of piano lessons would cease. Lil was to continue her musical studies at school, and it was my hope that any ambitions for me in that line would die a natural death. However, a music teacher gave lessons in the village, and I was signed on. A more reluctant pupil poor Miss Hill never had. She seemed to me a very old lady, small and afflicted with some spinal disability. She looked after her father, a handsome old gentleman who was probably then in his 70s, so that his daughter was probably then only in her 40s. She dressed in dark clothes and wore a gold chain and spectacles. She was exceedingly kind and patient, but kept a ruler at hand for tapping errant fingers. I knew that ruler well. I progressed slowly and painfully through Ezra Reed and can still play Sweet Memories to the mental accompaniment of Miss Hill's ruler. After that, new works were bought one by one, and as they had to be sent for and dispatched by post, I soon learnt a major delaying tactic. There was something called continental fingering, which showed the notes with 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 above them. This, I professed, was impossible for me to follow, and I stuck out for English fingering, always the patriot, which showed the thumb as a cross and the fingers numbered 1 to 4. This, for some reason, always took longer to procure, so that I could rattle away for another week or two at Ezra Reed or Reger and save myself and Miss Hill's ruler a good deal of unnecessary activity. After my half-hour ordeal, Miss Hill gave me a cup of tea and a biscuit, and once some Edinburgh rock, which was new to me and has remained a weakness of mine ever since. I was much intrigued by a paper cutout ball fixed to the ceiling, which she explained was the flies' playground, and which kept them away from the rest of the room, in theory. I grew very fond of Miss Hill as time passed. My lessons took place after school, and she would accompany me, after our tea party, along a grassy lane by the side of her house to a footpath across strawberry fields which gave me a quick way home. The house was beautiful, built in Queen Anne's reign, and standing high above the road, as so many houses did in that village. The garden was composed of a number of flower beds surrounded by low box hedges, and here old Mr. Hill would be strolling or sitting on a garden seat. He was always well wrapped up, a white silk muffler at his throat. I was particularly impressed by the way he took off his cap to me, displaying silvery hair, and gave me a courtly little bow. Not many people treated me so politely, and I much appreciated his courtesy. One winter afternoon of bitter cold, it began to snow. Dusk was falling, and winter's whirling snowflakes made it darker still. Miss Hill was much perturbed, and there was no way of getting in touch with my parents, for neither household had a telephone. I was quite game to strike out on my own, and rather looked forward to being part of the wild weather, but Miss Hill insisted on my sitting by the fire whilst she overcame the problem. Luckily, she remembered that Mr. Stanley the milkman should be arriving, and as his farm was near our home, he would give me a lift. I was wrapped up as carefully as a Christmas present, scarf arranged over my mouth and chin, and tied securely behind my back whilst we awaited Mr. Stanley. When he came, the position was explained to him, and I was welcomed on board his milk float. My music case was stuffed under a shelf at the front. Mr. Stanley flicked his whip, and Miss Hill waved from the lighted doorway. It was a blissful journey through the flurry of snow. I stood up at the front watching the flakes melt as they landed on the pony's black back. We fairly spanked along, the pony snorting and tossing his head at this strange element and anxious to get back to a warm stable. It was the most exciting ride I had ever had. There was nothing, I decided, to touch a milk float for perfect transport, and I was sorry when the trip ended at my gate and I had to wave goodbye to Mr. Stanley. The business of lifts to and from school I soon had organized. It began, I think, with an offer from Mr. Curtius of Julian Brimstone Farm one wet lunchtime. He had been to the post office in his van, saw me emerging from the school, and kindly ran me home through the puddles. This was such a superior alternative to the 1.25 foot slog home and back that I began to take note of regular transport, which at times ran conveniently to my school hours. On Wednesdays, I was sometimes lucky enough to catch Mr. Tutt's van. He was a fishmonger, and we dealt with him regularly. Occasionally, Mr. Groom the baker went our way. Mr. Smallwood, the other baker, drove a small gig on his rounds, but would not be prevailed upon to give lifts. I was sorry about this, as he had a particularly handsome pony, and I should have relished a ride behind it. But my most enjoyable lift was on a Monday afternoon when the corn chandler Hodsall drove a massive cart heaving with sacks of grain, seed, cattle food, and the like through the village just as we came out of school. He was a slow, taciturn man. Now that I come to think of it, he was probably not Mr. Hodsall himself, but I always thought of him so. I don't suppose we exchanged more than a dozen words during our journey. He sat, the reins slack upon the great back of his cart-horse, with clay pipe upside down in his mouth. I was content to watch the swaying back, surrounded by the wholesome smell of grain, and leaning against one of the sturdy sacks, my legs dangling from the wooden plank that served as a bench. He pulled up outside my house without a word, getting down himself to grope under the wagon for the skid pan which hung from a chain beneath it. He took no notice of my thanks, affixed the skid pan as advised by the wooden notice on the bank, clambered up again, and set off, wordless, down the hill. I was never a pony-mad little girl, but I loved these horses which I met now and again, and was glad that I experienced for a short time that fast-dying era of horse-drawn transport. Later, I was to make use of some of these memories when I began to write novels. Accepting or asking for lifts from strangers was taboo, of course, and my parents made this plain, but they knew my benefactors well by this time, and knowing the pleasure I derived from my rides, they appreciated the kindness which prompted them. Beginning to question. When I was promoted from Miss Ellis's class to the other side of the marmalade-colored partition, I sat in a desk with Nora and was under Mr. Clark's tutelage. At least for most of the day I was under Mr. Clark's eye, but when our daily arithmetic lesson occurred, I was banished to my former standard, as I was so backward in the subject. I had managed to struggle along with the 4 rules in hundreds, tens, and units, and even in pounds, shillings, and pence, thanks to my early grounding. But when awful problems about Arthur having twice as much pocket money as Gwendolen, although only a third of Ned's, I began to falter. As for dripping taps over baths, express trains passing each other, and all the rest of Standard Five's problems, they were far too much for me, and it was from then on that I was the despair of innumerable mathematics teachers until I was 18. After that, no one bothered, much to my relief. But the rest of the day was spent in the happy company of Nora and the top classes of the school. Mr. Clark was a cheerful man, and we learned quite a lot, and Nora and I were delighted to be sharing a desk. One day Mr. Clark boomed at us, "Nora and Dora, don't talk any more," which we considered the height of wit. I hope we stopped exasperating him, at least for a time, but we had so much to talk about that I am sure our chatter continued. The school day was pretty regular. It began with prayers, then a scripture lesson, ghastly arithmetic, playtime, then geography or history. Somewhere fitted in was a lesson called drill, which took place in the playground and consisted of exercises done in 4 lines or teams. For this, the boys took off their jackets, and we girls stuffed our skirts into our knickers. No one changed footwear, so that boys with iron studs to their boots skidded around rather alarmingly. We also played ring games such as twos and threes, and sometimes rounders. In the afternoon, on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, we girls returned to Miss Ellis's care and faced needlework. I was about as competent at this as at arithmetic, and was usually allowed to practice different sorts of hems on a piece of unbleached calico which smelt of dog biscuits, and was soon spotted with blood pricks. Occasionally I was given the lowly task of polishing the steel knitting needles with a limp scrap of emery paper, while my clever contemporaries tackled aprons and handkerchief sachets and kettle holders. As far as I was concerned, rubbing away with my emery cloth, they were welcome. Meanwhile, the boys were busy with something called mechanical drawing, which involved a lot of work with rulers and pencils, copying cones and other large geometrical shapes set before them on Mr. Clark's desk. I suppose it trained their eyes and hands for some sort of future work, but it cannot have been much fun. Once a week, we had a much freer and easier drawing and painting lesson together, and we were supposed to bring something to the class for our subject. The girls were usually fairly responsible and arrived bearing a rose or daffodil, or perhaps a toy or an ornament from home on which to try their skill. The boys invariably had forgotten to bring anything, and as the afternoon school bell tolled, there was a mad rush to a privet bush in a nearby garden. The irate householder invariably emerged to protest at this wholesale assault on his hedge, but by that time the boys were halfway up the school steps. After playtime in the afternoon, things grew suitably easy, and we recited or sang from the National Songbook, or had a story read to us, or, better still, enjoyed something billed as silent reading, when we could get on with our own books. It was a well-ordered life, if a trifle slow, and we were content. Sometimes the day was enlivened by a visit from someone from the outside world. Mr. Fox, one of the managers, occasionally called to see if we were all present and correct, and read our names aloud from the register. We responded with, "Here, sir." My name, as always, caused difficulty, and Mr. Fox delighted our class by pronouncing it as Sharfer on one occasion and Chafee on another. It took some time for me to live this down. Another manager was Mrs. Richford, a kind and motherly lady who was more than welcome, as she always brought a large tin of fruit drops with her. We all loved a visit from Mrs. Richford. Now and again we had a visitor from other and more distant parts. One that I remember came to give us a lecture on the evils of drink, although at our age we had not met with much temptation in that line. However, he gave us a fiery address and hung a collection of diagrams over the blackboard which showed the result of consuming alcohol on various organs of the body. These were in color, a horrid tangle of incomprehensible tubes, and when the picture of a drunkard's heart was displayed, one of the big boys slipped quietly under his desk in a dead faint and had to be carried into the fresh air amidst general sympathy. I was particularly sorry, as he had recently asked me to be his sweetheart, which I took to be a step toward matrimony. However, fond of him as I was, I now felt I could not face a future with one quite so frail, and felt obliged to decline the honor some days later, when he had completely recovered. He bore the reverse so well that I suspect he had probably forgotten all about the offer. I had a number of proposals about this time, which, to be honest, I found rather a nuisance, especially as they seemed to come from boys I had hardly noticed before. One proposal came when I was particularly busy fishing for frog spawn in our pond. You know how it is when you are collecting frog spawn, such heavy, awkward, slippery stuff, particularly if equipped only with a wobbly butterfly net and a 1-pound jam jar. And I really could not give my full attention to his plea. In any case, I told him as I struggled with my task, I really preferred Alan, and if he asked me then, I should accept him. My suitor said that he quite understood, but if I changed my mind, or Alan did not come up to scratch, and he didn't, then his offer still stood. I can't help thinking that he must have grown up into a very nice man. Quite a number of children came from a distance and could not get home to lunch and back, as I did. And they brought their meal with them, for organized school dinners were many years ahead. Once or twice in very hot weather, I remember that I took sandwiches which my mother had prepared. They were wrapped in greaseproof paper and packed in a palm toffee tin, and usually there was an apple for dessert. We were allowed on fine days to take our meal to the village recreation ground some 100 yards away, and there to picnic. And it was on one of these occasions that I felt some shock in seeing one of my two fellow picnickers repasts. 2 thick slices of white bread and a cube of cheese seemed to be their lot, but what really staggered me was the fact that the food was wrapped in newspaper. There were even grayish smears on the bread from the newsprint, but all was demolished with gusto, to my secret bewilderment. More shocks awaited me. One little girl asked me to go with her to the shop, and there she asked for a specked orange, which mystified me. The crate was obligingly sorted over and an orange handed down by the shopkeeper, and the child gave a halfpenny for it. "What is a specked orange?" I asked on our way back to school. She showed me a dark brown spot on its peel. "But it's going bad," I protested. "That's why it's cheap," she told me. "It's specked." This exchange appalled me. Heaven knows we were far from rich ourselves, but my mother, who was an excellent cook, would never have allowed us to eat doubtful food, let alone set out to buy it. This incident gave me a great deal to think about. There were obviously different standards, and the one I had grown up to accept and never questioned until now might not be the correct one after all. My schoolfellow had enjoyed that specked orange. She had eaten it hungrily and even nibbled the marred skin with relish. Furthermore, she had been pleased to have bought something cheaply. The whole transaction had given her satisfaction. Could it be that my mother was over-careful? Was a specked orange good value for a halfpenny? Was it right to reject it, as I would have done, and to have paid twice as much for a perfect orange? It was a puzzle. Perhaps grown-ups were not always right after all. Perils and pastimes. The happy months slipped by, and every one brought fresh discoveries, and I probably learned as much on my walks to school as I did in the classroom. Spring brought not only violets and primroses, but fleshy toothwort, which I found under a cluster of elm trees. The honeysuckle put forth some of its first new leaves, and the walnut trees at Julian Brimstone Farm were auburn with young foliage. In the summer, I discovered silverweed, its feathery foliage flat in the chalky dust at the side of the road, and its bright yellow flowers like shallow cups which smelt of almonds. The crabapple tree dropped small unripe fruit no bigger than marbles, covered in gray velvet. In the autumn came the joy of hazelnuts and walnuts and plenteous supply of blackberries in the hedges. And in the winter, despite the intense cold of those windswept north downs, there was still plenty to admire. Snow could drift into piles which hid the hedges, swirling into fantastic shapes like clouds. Hollyberries and yewberries lit their dark foliage and gave promise of Christmas. There were hazards as well as joys on my journey. For one thing, the geese at Julian Brimstone Farm sometimes emerged from the yard and wandered about in the road, picking up grit or pecking at the grassy verge by the flint wall. They strongly resented anyone passing through their territory and set up a terrible honking cacophony as I attempted to edge past them. No wonder the Romans kept them as watchdogs. Worse still, they would pursue me, hissing malevolently, snake-like necks outstretched, eyes as cold and blue as the aquamarines in my mother's pendant. With wings flapping, they could get up a fine turn of speed, and fleeing from them one day, I fell in the gritty road and barked both knees. My lamentations brought forth Mr. and Mrs. Curtis, and I was taken into the farm kitchen and given first aid. The gentle swabbing I understood, But when Mr. Curtis dipped a wing feather, probably dropped by one of my adversaries, into a bottle of iodine and stroked the fiery stuff over my wounds, it was as much as I could do to quell my shrieks and to try and appear suitably grateful. In the summer, there was another problem. Wasps like to make their nests in the banks bordering the lane, and normally we could give them a wide berth and hurry by safely. But one day, a naughty boy who was with us thrust a stick into the hole and stirred up the contents. Rightfully incensed at this treatment, the wasps fizzed out of the hole and attacked us. I was wearing my mackintosh, and 2 or 3 of the monsters got inside and stung me fiercely. I was as furious as the wasps, and we all set about the boy who had disturbed them. As far as I can remember, he had no stings at all, as you might expect in this unjust world. But, except for such mishaps as these, we were a remarkably healthy lot, and I can't remember the first aid box at school ever being in much use. People had far fewer potions and pills in their homes then. Our own medicine box housed only such simple things as tins of Vaseline, boracic ointment, and boracic powder, which was dissolved in warm water to cure eye troubles. A large roll of pink lint for spreading on grazed knees and a few rolls of bandages in different widths with a bottle of medical disinfectant took up most of the room. The narrowest bandage was used to make doilies on battered fingers. A large brown jar of mixed cod liver oil and malt was a fixture in the cupboard during the winter months, and a revolting white mixture called Scott's Emulsion stood hard by, with a picture of a fisherman with an enormous fish draped over his shoulder and down his back on the label. These aids to health were largely for the benefit of my sister, who suffered from coughs in the winter, but I was obliged to gulp down some of the stuff now and again. Other winter ills, such as chilblains and chapped faces, were treated with Melrose from the former and Pond's cold cream for the latter. In the summer, stings were usually dabbed with a Reckitt's blue bag and sunburn eased with calamine lotion or witch hazel. But on the whole, our family and my school friends thrived in the boisterous downland air. Certainly those winters were enough to toughen up anyone, and of necessity we had plenty of exercise. Other activities cropped up. As well as my music lessons, I was enrolled as a brownie, and meetings took place once a week. Our brown owl was a daughter of one of the big houses in the village, so that we had the run of a large and well-kept grounds for learning such things as woodcraft, lighting campfires, and recognizing a variety of plants and trees. There was a summer house available for wet days, and here we struggled with knots, granny, reef, clovehitch, slip, and a score more whose names I forget, and whose making I never completely mastered. I liked my uniform and the tie pinned with a brass brooch with an elf on it to show that I was in the elf patrol. I liked playing in the grounds of the noble Queen Anne house, but I was not really an ardent brownie and never craved a sleeve full of badges, as some of my friends did. And I actively disliked squatting in a ring and making hideous noises at the beginning and end of sessions. My sister was enrolled as a girl guide, but as her school activities were so arduous, she soon made her escape and was, I suspect, much relieved. We were never to become great joiners of societies and clubs. We both played tennis on the new court, still remarkably uneven and needing to be marked out with a paintbrush and a bucket of whiting. Neither of us was much good, but we helped to make up a four now and again when grown-up friends came to play with my father. I was allowed to serve from the halfway line with my 8.5-ounce racket. My sister seemed to have a great deal of homework to do, and I felt sorry for her, sitting with her books spread out on the dining table and working by the light of an Aladdin lamp. She was a conscientious child and worried if things went wrong. She told me about life at her school, and bells which rang when a lesson ended, and the trek to the rooms where some specific subject was taught, such as the art room, the chemistry laboratory, the geography room, the botany room, and so on. There was something called the silence rule, which forbade talking on stairs and corridors. It would never do for Nora and me, I decided. There were desk inspections and uniform inspections and fortnightly reviews of work completed. Marks went from A to E instead of something out of 10 as at the village school. If you had 3 E's in a row, it seemed that you were sent to detention, a terrible disgrace. On top of that, she had the train journey, which involved changing at Orpington Station and invariably meant a wait of anything up to half an hour. It all sounded rather daunting to me and ominously reminiscent of the great school which I had first attended, all bustle and endeavor and trying to do better than the next child. My village school seemed much more delightful in comparison. My parents, I knew, had high hopes of my joining Lil when I was 11 years old. A few children at my school sat for a scholarship examination early in the year, and Margaret from the post office was successful and went on to Bromley, where she did very well. My Aunt Rose did her best to encourage my educational progress by keeping me supplied with such books as Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare and Golden Legends, which contain stories from all over the world, and one particularly affecting one called The Children of Lear. It was a horribly sad Irish tale about a princess who knitted vests from nettles for her brothers. I think they had been turned into swans, and this was the only way to turn them back into men. Looking back through the mists of time, I now wonder how she managed to transform nettles into knitting yarn. I found the whole thing deeply disturbing. My parents, too, made valiant efforts to educate us, and we took a monthly magazine edited by Arthur Mee called My Magazine, and at the end of each year the 12 issues were bound into one imposing volume. It must have been somewhat exasperating for our parents to see that the first thing we turned to was a page of drawings and captions recounting the adventures of the Hippo Boys, who were almost as enchanting as Mrs. Bruin and her pupils in Tiger Tim's Weekly, whose escapades I followed with rapture. However, quite a lot of general knowledge seemed to be absorbed from the more educational pages of My Magazine over the years, so that our parents' expenditure may have been justified after all. When Lil was not heavily engaged in her school affairs, we still gave our dolls some attention, read voraciously, ran errands, helped our father in the garden and our mother in the kitchen. Occasionally, we made toffee. It cost 6pence to make a meat tin full, and we bought the main ingredients at our nearest shop, which was at the foot of the hill. This village rejoiced, as it still does, of course, in the name of Pratt's Bottom. The shop was kept then by an imposing lady called Mrs. Bird. We bought from her 1 pound of Demerara sugar and 1/4 of an ounce of desiccated coconut. These 2 purchases took all our 6pence, the equivalent of today's 2.5 pence. Having trudged back up the hill, we put half a cup of water into a saucepan, a large lump of butter, and let it melt. Then we added the sugar and coconut and stirred assiduously. When it thickened, we turned the lovely mess into a meat tin and tried to possess our souls in patience. Scraping the saucepan and rasping the goo from the wooden spoon with our teeth helped pass the time. Apart from the bliss of having such an enormous amount of sweet stuff all at once, there was the exquisite suspense of waiting to see if it turned out as fudge or toffee. Either way, we were happy, and there were no prouder cooks in the kingdom. And we'll continue with this reminiscence next time.